Hi, I'm Mr. Cyr the Shop Teacher. Well, if your yard looks anything like mine, you're gonna have bikes everywhere because there's no place to put them. In today's video, I'm gonna show you how to make a bike rack to solve that problem. If you're looking for the plans, I'll put a link in the description below. You'll also notice that the bike rack that I built is a little bit different than the one in the plans. All I did differently was I made it longer and I added some extra braces so that I could park bikes on either side of the stand. Okay, we're gonna gear up to cut our braces. If you're one of those good students that actually reads their plans, you're gonna notice that you need to cut 10 of these things. Now, you could measure 10 times. That's fine by me if you want to do that, but there are smarter ways of working. So what I would do if I'm building something like this is I would set up what's called a stop block, okay? So that I only have to measure once and I just cut, okay? So basically what that is, it's a piece of wood, and then we are going to clamp this piece of wood to the bench, and then we just butt up. Well, actually this piece of wood is precisely 16 inches away from the blade, and we just butt our piece of wood up to the stop block, cut, remove our piece, slide the lumber again, cut, remove it, cut, okay, and rinse and repeat, right? It'll take less than a few minutes. It'll take longer to set up the stop block than it will to cut all your pieces, but the other advantage is that I'm going to have 10 pieces that are pretty much the same. If you measure 10 times, well, you know, depending on how good you are at measuring and laying out, you might get, most of your pieces might be the same, but chances are, especially if you're a high school student, you're going to have 10 different pieces and your assembly is going to be a lot more difficult. Okay, so to set up the stop block, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lower my miter saw here, okay, and I'm going to lock it in place, like so. I'm going to take my tape measure and pull it out, lock it in place, slide it up to the blade, okay, and put the stop block at the 16-inch mark of my, excuse me, of my tape measure. And I'm going to take a quick clamp and I'm going to clamp my stop block in place. There's a couple things that you want to know about when you're using a stop block that could actually mess up your measurements, okay? After every cut, obviously there's going to be sawdust created, right? And that sawdust is going to eventually, if you're not paying attention, it's going to build up in this corner right here. Okay, so, and what's going to happen is it's actually gonna your cuts won't be accurate anymore because look what happens. I've got some sawdust there, and now I'm gonna slide my piece of wood right up to the sawdust, and now you can see a gap there, right? And obviously with every cut, more and more sawdust is going to build up, so every piece is going to be that much shorter, and by the end you're going to have 10 different pieces. So between cuts you do need to ensure that you clean up all the sawdust and that your 2x material is actually butted up against your stop block. Another thing that I would be mindful of is after you've completed a cut, you want to gently remove the material that you've just cut. Okay, basically what I'm trying to say is you don't want to accidentally bump this stop block, because if you bump it, you're actually going to change the measurement. Okay, so you actually want to wait for the saw to stop, and I'm going to demonstrate that in a second. And then you want to remove your material gently. Also, when you're lining up your next cut, you don't want to slam your piece of wood like that against the stop block. Of course, I'm exaggerating, but you guys saw what happened to the stop block on the camera here. It just moved. So it's not going to be 16 inches anymore. All right? So what you want to do is you want to gently place the piece of wood against the stop block in between cuts. Okay, let's talk about safety with the miter saw. In order to cut safely on the miter saw, your edge and face has to make contact with the fence and the machine table. So let me say that again. The edge of your workpiece or your lumber has to make contact with the fence, and the face has to make contact with the machine table. And as you can see here, that is not happening in either situation. You can see a noticeable gap here between the lumber and the machine table itself, and you can see a gap between the edge and the fence. If we proceed to cut this piece of wood, what's going to happen is as we're making our way through the end of the cut, the piece of wood is actually, or the top here is actually going to close in on the blade because the piece of wood is falling, and it's going to pinch that blade, and it's going to create kickback like you've never seen before. If you look here on the fence, this is kickback from a student, I think this year actually, where he was not careful cutting lumber, and that exact thing occurred, and it actually blew out a whole chunk from the fence right there. Chances of, I don't know, cutting your finger in this situation, very minimal, but chances of breaking an arm or something like that, very high, because you'll get this motion. It'll kick back this way. It'll basically kick out. It won't pull in, it'll kick out. So, all that being said, it's still possible to safely cut lumber on a miter saw. You just have to do it in the right way. And the right way is doing multiple passes. So what you're going to do is you're going to orientate this piece of wood on the machine so that you get the most contact possible, okay? And again, I'm not concerned about if I'm making contact with other parts of the fence or table on the bench here. I'm only concerned mainly with this area right here. If I can get the piece of wood to make contact with the fence on either side of the blade, as well as the machine table, that's a perfect scenario. It doesn't matter what's going on anywhere else along the length of the piece of wood. If it's making contact right here, it's safe to cut. Sometimes you have to flip the wood around a few times to try to find the safest way to cut it. In this situation, this is a piece of wood that is it's got a twist, it's got a bow, it's got a crown, it's cupped, it's got every defect you can think of.
Lynn Cheverfeet, please come to the office. Lynn Cheverfeet.
Lynn Cheverfeet to the office. So, we've got this, I think, in the safest way possible. We can flip it around to see if it changes. But I've got a gap there. I've got a gap at the fence. If I flip this piece around, let's see if it's any better. Oh, it actually is better if I flip it around. I'm actually making contact now with the fence in the back. I'm still not making contact with the table itself, but I am making contact with the fence, so it is a lot safer. So try to flip this piece around, your lumber around, to try to get it in the safest orientation possible, okay? Now, what we're going to do to cut this, again, I'm going to butt it up against my stop block very carefully as to not move the stop block, and then I'm going to do multiple cuts, okay? And what that means is I'm going to pull out the machine, I'm going to plunge, okay, then I'm going to come back up. I'm going to plunge about maybe a third of the way. I'm going to come back up, and I'm going to plunge again, maybe another third, and come back up, push the saw back, and finish the cut. And what that does is every time you pull the saw out and you go back in, it reshapes that curve. So where it would normally at the top here be closing in on the blade, when you come back out and you go back in for another plunge, it reshapes that curve. So in other words, you're not going to have that pinch, or the likelihood of that pinch is very, very low. Okay, but I should also say that the likelihood of kickback with defective material and a stop block increases dramatically, because now you've got a piece of wood that's actually wedged between the blade and the stop block. So when this cut is finished, and I'm going to demonstrate this in a couple minutes here, you're going to see this piece of wood drop and all of a sudden make contact with the machine table. That's the point where if we didn't do this right, it's going to get wedged between the stop block and the blade, and the saw is going to kick back. Okay, but it shouldn't happen if we do multiple passes, and the more passes the better. In fact, the more twisted and defective the material, probably the more passes you should make. Okay, now I should also mention that the safest way to cut dimensional lumber is still a circular saw, okay? Because a circular saw is the opposite, essentially, of a miter saw. And there's no chance of kickback because you're moving the saw against the material, okay? So anyways, let's proceed to cutting this material. And when I cut, pay attention to this area right here, and you're gonna see this piece of wood drop, 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 and finally at the end it's gonna drop and make contact with the table. And that's exactly why we've got to reshape that curve using multiple passes. Alright, I'm going to show you guys how to lay out the brace. Okay, this is brace number 1, the simplest one. The best way to go about this is to make a template. This saves you from having to, do the layout over and over again. Well, if you look at the plans, 10 times. So instead of doing it 10 times, we're going to do it once by making a template. I'm going to do this backwards here, and hopefully this will help you see a little bit better. So we're going to reproduce what you see here on the back side. So you take your 2x6 that you've already cut to length, obviously, and you need 2 measurements according to the plans. You need 3.5 inches and 6 inches. So I'm going to take my speed square here, I'm going to put it along the edge, and I'm going to mark 3.5 inches. Okay, then I'm going to take my speed square, I'm going to put my pencil on the line that I just made, slide the speed square up to it, and just kind of trace that line like that. Okay, and now I'm going to make another line at 6 inches. Okay, again with a speed square or quick square, whatever you want to call it. Okay, same idea right there. Flip it over, put your pencil on your mark, slide up to your mark, and there you go. Okay, and now I'm going to take a steel rule or any sort of straight edge, and I'm going to draw a line to connect both lines. Just like that. And I'm going to mark an X because that is my waist. Okay, and I'm going to do the same on the other side, of course. So again, 3.5 inches. Some of these quick squares can be tough to read sometimes. This one is particularly difficult because it's yellow. Okay, so there's my 3.5 inches, and again 6 inches. And draw a line to connect both lines. There you go. Okay, before we proceed to cutting, I just want to mention a few things. I always think about keeping the best part of the material. So in other words, if there's some sort of a defect, I want to plan to cut it off if I can. So I'll show you a few examples of that. Okay, so here's our template. Oh, you might want to mark it temp. Let's see if I can. Oh, apparently I can't write backwards, but there we go. Not bad, not bad. Okay, so I've got a piece of wood here that Ah, here we go. Now I know why I chose this piece of wood. See this knot up here? Well, if I plan out my layout correctly, I can actually get rid of that knot. I can actually cut that right off, okay? So what you're gonna do is you're gonna plan this knot to be this corner right here, and then that knot's gonna disappear, okay? Another example is wane, as you can see right here. Now, I can't cut off the wane, but what I can do is plan so that when this project gets assembled, it gets assembled this way. In other words, the wane is on the bottom. No one's ever gonna see it. If I don't plan my material very well, then this is what people are gonna see. Right? They're gonna see the wane, which maybe it's not a big deal to you, but it is to me. And there is some splintering here, and there's all kinds of, you know, not so pretty stuff. So again, if you plan your layout, if you plan your material well, you can actually eliminate a lot of the defects that you find in dimensional lumber. Okay, now let me show you how to transfer the lines from your template to your other pieces. So I'm going to take my template, okay, and I'm going to line up the bottom, okay? So again, I don't want people to see this wane, so the wane's going to be on the bottom. And you can see obviously on my template here that this is the top. So I'm going to line up the bottom here with my finger, make sure they're nice and flush. I'm just going to transfer the line like so. Okay, that's simple. Okay, then I'm going to flip these like this. I think you can see I'm going to line them up at one end. And again, I'm going to transfer the lines. You can also do this with a square, by the way, if you want to be more precise. But there is a point where, you know, it's not really worth obsessing over dimensional lumber because it's not perfect. It's full of defects. It's not made to build furniture, so we're not going to fuss over too many details. And finally, I'm going to flip it one more time. And again, line up the bottom. So the bottom now is right here. Make sure you're being consistent. Okay, and there you go. Now I'm going to take my steel rule and I'm just going to connect the lines again. And I'm going to repeat this process 10 times for each brace. Okay, and if you use the same template and you're pretty accurate, your results will be fairly consistent. Okay, and there you have it. Oh, okay. So I just took my template, as you can see here, and used it to transfer the lines to another piece. And again, I'm just going to repeat this process for every brace. Okay, so we're ready to cut these corners off now of our braces. And to do this, we can use the miter saw. I've got to say, it's a little bit of a sketchy cut, and if you're inexperienced, it's probably not a good idea for you to do this. However, if you do have some experience, I'm sure it'll be fine. If you can't use the miter saw due to inexperience, you can use there's a number of different ways to cut this. You can use a circular saw, you can use a jigsaw, bandsaw. Any of those machines or tools will work just fine and be safe. Okay, but on the miter saw, the reason this is a sketchy cut, there's a few reasons. Number one, as you can see here, my piece is wider than it is long. Okay, whenever that happens, there's a good chance that this piece can move sideways or laterally against the fence. Excuse me. And that's a potential hazardous situation. Okay, however, this is going to be a relatively safe cut because my piece of wood, okay, the end of my piece of wood is making contact with the fence on either side of the cut. Okay, so in other words, my cut is in the middle and the fence is on either side. if that were not the situation, I would never attempt this, because as you're cutting, obviously the saw is going to tend to pull the piece sideways, probably to the right. Okay, so I've got my fence set up on this particular saw. You can slide the fence and make those sort of adjustments so that you do have proper support on either side of the fence. Okay, so I'm going to set up my saw for this cut, and according to the plans, again, if you're a good student and you actually read the plans, you'll see that the measurement is 18 degrees. So I'm just going to swing my miter saw up to 18. Okay, right there. And we're not going to be too concerned with precision here. Again, mainly because we're working with dimensional lumber, and it's not accurate to begin with. All the pieces are different width, different thicknesses. They're twisted, they're bowed, they're crowned, they're cupped, etc., etc. So we're going to get as close as we can, but we're not going to obsess over that kind of stuff. If you do want to make a perfect project, I suggest starting from rough material, jointing, planing, and squaring lumber, and that whole thing. Okay, so I'm going to line up my miter saw here with my line. Okay, so that's where my cut is going to be. Okay, and the way I'm going to perform this cut is I'm going to pull it out, the saw out, plunge all the way down, and push all the way forward. Wait, let go of the trigger, wait for the saw to stop, and pull the saw back up. Okay, so again, the motion for completing this cut is out, all the way down, plunge, all the way forward, let go of the trigger, wait for the saw to stop, and then pull it back up. And you'll notice where I'm holding the material. I'm not going to hold it back here, because that's obviously very close to the blade. I'm going to hold it off to the side here, and I'm actually gripping it with my thumb and index finger, as you can see here, and I'm holding the piece, I'm pushing the piece against the fence, because that's the way the saw is going to move, right? So that's the way the piece of wood is going to want to move. So that's where I'm holding it. I'm not concerned so much about this right now, the lateral movement. I'm more concerned about making sure that the end, the two corners, maintain contact at all times with the fence. Okay, so here we go. Let's perform this cut. You probably noticed that I had to change my tactic a little bit. I realized that once I was about 2/3 of the way through the cut, it was difficult to push the saw. And if I would have kept on going, I would have eventually caused a kickback, because the saw blade would have gotten stuck in the kerf. Okay, so what I did, as you probably noticed, is I had to pull back out, push or slide the saw back, and then plunge that final cut. Okay, and it was safe. Okay, no problems at all with that cut. Now, I just want to mention another thing. You'll notice twists, right? If you have twisted lumber, I've got to say, don't try this. Don't try this unless you have a lot of experience, because that is just way too dangerous. Okay, if you do have experience with the saw and you're gonna cut a twisted piece of lumber this way, the important thing to remember again is that the piece of wood makes contact with the table where the blade is cutting. Okay, so there's a gap actually right here in this corner, and that's okay, because I'm making full contact near the blade on the other side, which is what I want. Okay, I don't want any gaps on this side. I want my piece of wood to be touching the fence, and the table nearest to the blade cut at all times. That is the golden rule of cutting twisted lumber on the miter saw. Okay, so we're gonna get ready to lay out our wall plates. Before we do that, we've got to orientate our lumber properly. Chances are the lumber is not straight. The lumber just isn't straight. Even if you do find a straight piece at the lumber yard, guess what? You leave it overnight and the next day it's got some sort of a defect. All of a sudden it's going to be twisted, or it's going to have a bow or a crown or something. Okay? But it is possible to build straight with crooked lumber. You've just got to know how to work with the defects. All right, so here we go. We're going to do that right now. Now, what's important is that you know about two defects, okay? You want to know about a crown and a bow. All right, so we're going to identify our crowns first. Okay, so if I take the piece of wood and I close one eye and I look down the edge of the piece of wood, and I can see that it either has a convex or a concave line, then that's going to tell me if my bow or my crown is up or down. And I want it to be like a bridge or a rainbow or whatever you want to call it. Okay, I want it to look like a rainbow. So if it's looking like a rainbow, right, then my crown is up and that's what I want. If it's backwards, it's going to look like it's dipping down like this, okay? All right, and that's not what I want. I want my crown up, okay? Sometimes wood is fairly straight. In other words, maybe there won't be a noticeable crown. Well, then don't worry about it. But if you do see a noticeable crown, make sure that crown is up on both pieces, okay? The next thing you want to do is you want to make sure that your bow is in, okay? In other words, if I had to take my two pieces of wood and put them together, they're going to look like this, okay? They're going to touch on each end, but they're not going to touch in the middle, okay? And the reason for that is when we attach these two pieces together with the braces, what's going to happen is the braces are going to suck those two pieces in and it's actually going to straighten them out. Okay, but if we go the other way like this, I can't even do it. Oh, here we go, like that. Then it's possible, but it takes a lot more effort. It's easier to pull the wood in when your bows are in facing each other. Okay, so there's a few ways you can figure this out. You can turn the piece over and look down the face, and again, you can see if it's either doing a rainbow or not, right? Or you can just put the two pieces of wood together like you see here. Get them to touch at the ends, and now I can see they're touching at both ends, but they're not touching in the middle. There's a gap in the middle. So I know right now that my bows are facing in. So that's good. That means I'm ready to lay out my wall plates. If I flip one of these pieces around, however, which I'm going to do right now, and then all of a sudden they're touching in the middle, but they're not touching on the ends, then I know one of my pieces is backwards. All right? So again, to recap, you want your crowns up, so you want your pieces of wood to look like a rainbow, and then you want your bows in like this. So they should be touching on the ends, and there should be a gap in the middle. And this will be like 90% of the time. Unless you've got that one tree or one of those few trees in the world that happen to grow straight. But it's unlikely. Okay, so as we talked about, I've got my bows facing in and my crowns facing up. Okay, so my lumber is properly orientated, so I can begin the layout. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a tape measure. I'm going to hook the end here of my lumber, and of course my lumber is even. Okay, I'm flush here. Both pieces are even with each other. Okay, I'm going to hook my tape measure there, lock it in place, and according to your plans, your first measurement goes at 1.5 inches, and that's representative of the thickness of your 2x4. Okay, the 2x4 brace. Okay, so there we go, 1.5. And then you'll notice on the plans as well that there is a 2-inch space between two braces. So 1.5 plus 2 inches is, yes, 3.5. Very good. Okay, so I'm going to make another line right there. Okay, and then I've got to go 1.5 over from this line because that's, again, the thickness of another brace. So 3.5 plus 1.5 is 5. So, to recap, I've got a mark at 1.5, 3.5, and 5 inches. I'm done with the tape measure. Now I'm going to take a tool. There's a few different tools you can use for this. You could use a framing square. I'm sorry, I'm not... The shot is too close for you to see this tool. However, this tool is too large for this job right now. It's going to bump into the camera tripod. So I found something else that's going to work. I'm going to use this Mitre Square right here. And basically what I'm looking for is a tool where the tongue of the tool is the same thickness as a 2x lumber product. Okay, so in other words, 1.5 inches thick. So if I actually measure across the tongue here, I've got 1.5 inches, and you're gonna see why in just a second. Okay, so what I do is I slide the Mitre Square right up to the end of the two pieces, hold it in place, and I just scribe that line. Okay, then I'm going to slide it over, and I'm going to line it up between my two next lines, and look what I can do. I can just go on either side of the tool. Easy breezy, like that. Just like if you're doing framing on a house. Okay, and I'm going to mark an X just so that I know where my braces go. You can also use a quick square for this job. That would do the trick as well. Okay, anything really that's a square will work. I just find that personally something with the 1.5 inch tongue works really well because it saves me a little bit of time in the work that I have to do. Okay, we've got our first set of measurements done. Now we're going to move on to the next set of braces. Okay, if we look at the plans, it says that we need to, the next brace starts at 16.5 inches from the end of this one right here where I'm pointing. Okay, so I'm going to hook my tape measure on the end and I'm going to do the math. Okay, there's a couple ways you can go about this. Yes, you could start measuring from this line. However, the chances of making a mistake are that much greater. So I'm actually going to hook my tape measure on the end and I'm going to do the math. So 5 inches plus 16.5 is, that is correct, 21.5 inches. So I'm going to move this piece of wood down. Okay, and 21.5 inches is right here, as you can see on the camera. So that's where my next brace is going to begin, so I'm going to make a line there. Okay, and again, 1.5 inches is the thickness of that brace, so my next line is going to be at 3 inches, and then 2 inches over from that is going to be the beginning of my next brace, which is 25 inches. And the final measurement is going to be 26.5 because again, my brace is 1.5 thick. Okay, and I'm going to take my handy dandy Mitre Square here and scribe those lines. And put the X. All right, that is my next set of braces right there. If we look at the plans and we keep on going, now we find out that from this line right here, we've got to go over 19 inches. And again, the best way to do this is by measuring with your tape measure hooked on the end, not starting to measure from that line. So again, we have to do some math. All right, so we're at 26.5 inches here, and we have to add 19 inches to that measurement. So, yes, that measurement, you are correct, is 45.5 inches. So let's scooch it over to 45.5. Okay, here we are. So 45.5 right there comes up. Okay, 1.5 inches thick is my 2x. So my next measurement's gonna be 47, 2-inch space between. So then I'm gonna go to 49, and again 1.5 thick, so 50.5. Done with the tape measure. Again, put the square on here. Make sure that square is butted up against the face of your material, otherwise you're not going to be drawing square lines. And there we have it. As for the rest of the layout, this process just repeats itself. Look at the plans, and I'm sure, and in fact I'm confident that you'll be able to figure it out. Alright, I've got all my pieces cut, my braces and my plates, everything's laid out. I'm going to do one extra thing that you totally don't have to do. This is optional on your part. This is me just wanting to dress up the project a little bit. I'm going to use a router table with a round over bit, and I'm going to profile the edges along all the top of my braces as well as my plates. I just think it dresses up the project a little bit. That's all. And again, it is not a requirement. Your project will look fine without this step. Okay, if you're gonna do this, the one thing you want to keep in mind is you don't want to profile the ends, because it's going to look funny when you put your project together. You just want to do the top. So you have to be good at starting and finishing your profiles. That just takes time and practice. And the other thing is, again, you're dealing with twisted lumber. So the piece might wobble on the router table itself, just like it did with the miter saw. But all you have to remember is that the piece of wood is making contact with the table nearest to the bit. And that way you'll have a nice even profile along the edge. If you don't, if your piece is wobbling like this on the table as you're routering, you're going to look at your profile and you're going to see that it's uneven. It's not, you don't have clean straight lines. Okay? So again, just make sure that immediate to the bit, your piece of wood maintains contact with the router table, and you will have a beautiful looking project. Okay, so this is the part of the project where we need to talk about finishing. There's two parts to finishing. There's actually preparing the surface in terms of sanding, and there's also grain enhancement. We'll talk about grain enhancement later. Let's talk about sanding now. I've still got individual pieces here, so this is the ideal time to do any sort of sanding. And given that this is dimensional lumber and it's not going to look pretty, I should probably spend a little bit of time and sand some parts down. Personally, I'm not going to do a whole lot of sanding because I'm going to paint this a solid color. I'm not going to stain or anything like that, so I don't have to worry about getting pencil marks off or manufacturer marks, that sort of thing. I'm not concerned with that. I'm concerned mainly with making the surface somewhat smooth, but more importantly, I don't want splinters because I don't want my kids getting slivers. I don't want punctured tires and of that sort. Okay, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time with a palm sander and some 150 180 grit, and I'm just going to get out the rough stuff, and that's it, and that'll be good enough for me. What you do depends on what kind of finish in terms of grain enhancement that you choose. Again, if you're going to stain, you've got to spend a lot of time sanding. if you're gonna paint a solid color, you know what? As long as you prime, because the primer is what's gonna hide all the marks, then you're good to go with just a basic sanding job. All right, we're ready to assemble. To do this part, you need some sort of fastener to put everything together. Personally, I'm going to use nails, and specifically, I'm going to use my Passwood framing nailer to put this together just because it does a really quick and clean job. However, if you don't have a framing nailer at home, that's fine. You can use screws. The rule is you need a fastener that is double the thickness of the material that you are putting together. So we're using 2x4s or 2x material, which is actually 1.5 inches thick. So if you do the math, 1.5 times 2 is 3. So you need a 3-inch long fastener. So I would recommend a number 8 screw that is 3 inches long, or any 3-inch framing nail would just be fine, would just do the trick. Okay, so here we go. I've got my plates separated. Basically, I just took them and I spread them apart, and I put the braces in between. I've got a bar clamp here to hold things together while I nail, because there's a lot of power that comes out of these framing nailers, and it can easily just kind of move stuff. So this way, if I clamp it, it stays in place, and I can put it together that much quicker and more accurately. So I got my safety glasses on. I'm going to keep my fingers far away from where I'm nailing, and let's get to work. You'll notice that I used 2 nails. For a 2x4, that's pretty standard for framing. It's just 2 nails per stud. So in this case, 2 nails per brace is sufficient. If you only use 1, then the brace can still pivot, right? So you need at least 2 to lock it in. So I'm gonna continue here, and I'm gonna finish putting this whole thing together, and then we're gonna go on to the next step, which is painting. Just a few finer points about the assembly. Number 1, I would not use any twisted braces on either end of the project, for a few reasons. Number 1, those corners just won't look nice. They won't look like they're lining up. One of them will and the other one won't, and it'll be impossible to get them to line up nicely, and your project just won't look that nice. The second thing is the 2 end pieces. I would recommend pre-drilling and definitely screwing those pieces. Why, you might ask? Because if you don't pre-drill, chances are you're gonna split the wood, okay? And what pre-drilling does is it actually prevents that from happening. And for that, you don't need to countersink. All you need to do is just use a 1/8 inch twist bit, and you just need to drill through the plate. You don't need to drill through the brace, although you can. And then drive a number 8x3 screw into those ends, and you will have a really nice looking complete project. I'm standing outside the shop, and I just finished applying my first coat of primer. I decided to go with an oil-based primer for a few reasons. Number 1, instead of sanding all those pencil marks and again those manufacturing marks, it's easier for me. I enjoy painting more than I do sanding, so I decided to prime to cover all that up first. And I need to put 2 coats of primer on before I put the paint on. Number 2, the oil-based primer instead of a water-based will just last longer. So over time, my project's just gonna last longer. Given that it's gonna be outside for the rest of its life, I wanna have the maximum life out of this project, because it does take a lot of time to build. I am going to put on top of this an exterior acrylic paint, and I'm going to do 2 coats of that. And just remember that with SPF lumber, that's spruce pine fir, you can't just leave SPF lumber outside. You have to coat it. You have to protect it against the environment or against the weather. Hence the paint. You can also apply an outdoor stain and a number of different products. However, if you go the stain route, you'll have to do a lot of sanding and a lot of prepping before you apply the final finish. And personally, I don't enjoy that type of work. I just want to get it done. So that's why I decided to go the prime and paint method. You'll also notice that I've made a little stand so that I can paint basically all the way around the project in one shot. So I just have to flip it like this. So I don't have to paint and then let it dry, flip it over, paint again. I could do one coat in one shot. So that's what I did. I just finished this coat, and according to the instructions, I have to wait 2 hours to apply the second coat, which is coming up very soon here. And I also went with a spray method instead of a brush and roller, just because it's really hard to get into all the nooks and crannies with a brush, and it's much easier to go in and spray, and it also gives a nice clean finish. And I think it doesn't take as long to spray. The downside to spraying, however, is the cleaning. You have to clean that gun really well afterwards. Otherwise, it's going to get clogged up, and you're just not going to, it's going to be no good. You're going to have to get new parts for it. So that's the way I did it. There's lots of ways you can go about finishing your project. Bottom line is, you can't just leave regular spruce pine fir outside without any protective finish, so you'll have to do something to protect it. The other alternative I should mention to close is that you can use a treated lumber. That would eliminate all need for finishing. You just have to treat the ends, the cut ends. Alright, so I'm going to finish painting this guy, and then we'll see what it looks like at the end. As you can see, I'm done painting. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to let this project sit between two sawhorses off the ground for a good while so that that paint cures. If I don't let the paint cure, what's going to happen is it's just going to rub off as soon as we start using it. The tires are going to rip the paint off. It's just sitting on the ground. It's going to rub the paint off when it moves on the ground. So I'm going to let that paint cure as long as possible before I start using this project. Well, there you have it. Now you have a solution to solving that bike storage problem in your yard. I'm Mr. Cyr the Shop Teacher. Hope you learned something. See you next time.